The Balkans, 1944. The oil fields in Ploesti, Romania, are Hitler's main source of oil. They are heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns which hit many US aircraft. If hit, American pilots were instructed to fly over the Danube into the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is under Axis occupation. Nevertheless, it has a strong resistance movement known around the world as the Chetniks. They were a guerrilla force formed from the remnants of the Yugoslav army. The Chetniks have saved more than 500 pilots from Nazi capture. Once on safe ground, the pilots wanted to meet the Chetnik commander, General Draza Mihailovic. For them, he was a legend. At the start of the war, these pilots were just boys who grew up with the mainstream entertainment of the time, comic books. The golden age of comics in the US began in the 30s and lasted until television entered American homes. During the war, characters based on actual heroes joined the ranks of fictitious ones such as Phantom and Superman. They were mainly drawn from the armies of the great Allied powers. The most notable exception to this rule was General Mihailovic, who was from the relatively small Yugoslav army. His character appeared in at least 9 US comics. Why was General Mihailovic the exception? How did he become a legend in US popular culture? Who was General Mihailovic? Ivanjica, Western Serbia, the birthplace of General Draza Mihailovic. From when he was born, only one of these buildings still stands, the church.
Dragoljub Draža Mihailović rođen je 14. aprila 1893. godine po starom kalendaru. Draža je kršten u ovoj crkvi 2. maja iste godine. Dražu je krstio sveštenik Jovan Ajdačić. Ovo je kopija originalne krštenice Draže Mihailovića koju sam pronašao u crkvenoj knjizi.
Today, it is difficult to determine where his father Mihailo's house was located. It is assumed that it stood at the end of the main street on the right-hand side. Many years later, as is often the case with famous men, Draža returned to his birthplace, but this time cast in bronze. Before he came back, his name was forbidden for a long time. In the whole of Yugoslavia, it was displayed in only one place, on the headstone of his parents' grave in Ivanjica. He erected the monument together with his sister Jelica.
Ovo su grobovi Dražinih roditelja, oca Mihaila i majke Cmiljane. Draža je potpisan kao Dragiša jer su ga tako zvali u porodici kad je bio mali.
Draža's parents Mihailo and Smiljana died young from tuberculosis. Draža and his sister Jelica moved to Belgrade in 1901. They moved in with their uncle Velimir, a major in the veterinary corps. This is the first photo taken in Belgrade. This is also the only known photo of Jelica. She was murdered by the communists after they captured Belgrade at the end of 1944. A few postcards that Jelica sent to Draža during World War I were saved. Jelica was one of the first female architects in Serbia. Draža was an excellent student. According to his 4th grade report card, he was not talented for singing and gymnastics. In all other subjects, he received the highest marks.
U 3. mušku gimnaziju Draža je upisan 1904. godine. Kada je pošao u 3. razred, 1906. godine, gimnazija je premeštena u ovu, tada upravo izgrađenu zgradu.
Draža's military career started on September 1st, 1910, when he enrolled in the military academy in Belgrade, in its 43rd class. He chose a military career, as he later wrote, believing that the army is ruled by an absolute quest for justice. He graduated 4th highest in his class. The building of the Officers' Club in Belgrade dating back to that period still exists. The strategist that marked the period of Draza's studies was Serbian General, later Field Marshal, Radomir Putnik. It was a time of great change in warfare. The advent of machine guns and fast-loading cannons meant that infantry could no longer advance in tight formations. A soldier in a unit could now be over 100 meters from where an officer was. In battle, he could not hear orders. Lower-ranking officers also might not be able to hear their superior officers' commands. The main idea of General Putnik was to train officers and even ordinary soldiers to autonomously assess battle situations and act in the spirit of received orders by relying on knowledge gained in the field. For Putnik, a soldier was not just a cog in a machine, but an individual with his own initiative and the freedom to express it. The Serbian army effortlessly implemented this principle because of a tradition that was already embedded in its operational doctrine. Officers were trained to treat soldiers like brothers and friends and to act as parents. Also, this principle was consistent with the Serbian mentality, characterized by the individual initiative, imagination, and non-conformity to the prescribed formalities. The doctrine of General Putnik was used in the training of the 43rd class. Draza Mihailovic turned out to be the best student of General Radomir Putnik. At first, it can be observed in non-adherence to formalities. For example, he often wore his cap irregularly, in this way expressing his individual flair. But it was also observed in matters of substance, as he was always vocal in expressing his opinion. However, not all of his superiors liked that. Thus, Mihailovic's army life was marred by a paradox. He was last to be promoted in his class, although he was amongst the first to be decorated for service in battle. Mihailovic completed his military academy training in breaks between wars. In the officers' records, we see that until 1920, he participated in 5 wars. The Serbian-Turkish War of 1912-1913, Serbian-Bulgarian War of 1913, Albanian Rebellion of 1913, the Great War 1914 to 1918, and Albanian insurgency of 1920. Throughout an officer's career, his characteristics were recorded by the higher command. Mihailovic was impeccable. Here is an observation of one of his superiors. Always keeps a cool head, shows great courage accompanied by high morale and personal initiative. Demonstrated capable leadership of his men and the entire unit. At the end of this period, Draza Mihailovic was rewarded with 10 medals, including gold medals for valor, 2 White Eagles with swords, and an English military cross. The involvement in the suppression of the Albanian revolts played a major role in his future career, because these were guerrilla wars. But of greatest importance was the fact that in every one of these 5 wars, the Serbian army was victorious. The high morale and winning spirit of Mihailovic's generation was formed as a result of these victories. Belgrade, August 11, 1913. Knez Mihailova Street is decorated for the celebration of a major event that will forever be remembered by Mihailovic and his contemporaries. That morning, on what is now known as Slavia Square, a Serbian army parade was held after winning 2 wars in quick succession, the First and the Second Balkan Wars. In this video, we see the famous strategist, General Radomir Putnik. The high morale of the Serbian military was reflected by the entire nation. Draza Mihailovic married in 1920. His wife was Jelica Brankovic, the sister of his classmate and best friend Borivoje, who was killed in the Battle of Cer. In these photos, we see Draza and Jelica at a family function in Novi Sad. During the 3rd decade of the 20th century, Mihailovic graduated from the Superior College of the Military Academy and acquired the rank of General Staff Officer. This title is the equivalent of today's Doctor of Military Sciences. Throughout the kingdom, there were only 160 General Staff Officers in total. As an elite officer, he served in the King's Guard. Afterwards, he was sent for specialization to France in the field of intelligence. Mihailovic later was posted as a military attaché of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in Sofia and then Prague. Around that time, he appeared on the front pages of the Belgrade press, where the general public first heard of him. Before he bought his house, Draza Mihailovic and his family lived in the Belgrade suburb of Senjak. He owned a boat and enjoyed spending time at the city's most popular bathing spot, Ada Ciganlija. This photo shows Draza with his friends at this location. He paid off the last installment for his house, located at 24 Bregalnica Street, right before the Great War started. This house still stands today. He kept many animals, including 2 horses, and at the front of his house, his car was parked, a black Chevrolet. Upon completing his career as military attaché, Draza Mihailovic returned to Belgrade and taught strategy and tactics at the military academy. Later, he was given the post of commanding a regiment in Slovenia, near the border with Austria. This was shortly after Hitler's annexation of Austria. Colonel Mihailovic was ringing alarm bells by then. He stated, "Hitler is already on our border. At some point he will cross it. Our military cannot resist him. The outcome of modern warfare is decided by tanks and aviation. There is no comparison on that level between us and the Germans. However, we must not capitulate either." Colonel Mihailovic put forth a plan of defense based on 2 key points. First, the army should be divided into 3 separate parts: Serbian, Croatian, and Slovenian. The kingdom had 3 constituent nations. He believed one of these 3, the Croatians, would not go to war against Hitler. Secondly, the military should withdraw from all major cities and northern plains. The Serbian part of the army was to concentrate in the wooded mountains between western Bosnia and southwestern Serbia. The rugged mountainous terrain would thwart Hitler's advantage in mechanized war and to a large extent in aviation. The backbone of this defense plan was to be formed by deploying specially trained units, the Chetnik battalions. Colonel Mihailovic wrote their training manual. By then, the Putnik doctrine in the Yugoslav army was replaced with the German military doctrine, which viewed the soldier as part of a machine, not as an individual. The main proponent of the German doctrine was General Mihailovic, who was appointed Minister of Defense in 1939. When Colonel Mihailovic submitted his report on Nedic's defense plan, Nedic sent him to prison for a month. The construction of fortifications along the northern border, which Mihailovic called a waste of money, continued with an increased intensity. However, one of Mihailovic's proposals was adopted. On April 24, 1940, the General Staff announced the establishment of the Chetnik Command as the operational base for the training of special units. It was 3 months before the British Army began deploying their special units, and 2 years before the Americans did the same.
Ono što ja mogu da kažem to je da su oni u obuci za gerilsko ratovanje, kao što su ove zelene beretke bile, koji sam ja, da je tu o gerilskom ratu isticano organizacija Draže Mihailovića i Draža Mihailović kao gerilski vođa. I ulazilo se u način borbe, organizovanje jedinica i tako dalje. Slavko Bjelajac je napisao knjigu za obuku zelenih beretki o gerilskom ratovanju. To je bilo njegovo iskustvo gerilskog ratovanja u zapadnim krajevima. Slavko Bjelajac je dogurao do čina rezervnog generala. I bio je sa službom u Pentagonu.
Novo. 5 knjiga Miloslava Samardžića sa velikim popustom. U kompletu su sledeće knjige. Prva. Draža, život i legenda. biografija jednog od najznamenitijih Srba 20. veka. Zašto se i danas skrivaju velike pobede Dražinih četnika? Draža kao nacionalni lider, Dražin put od junaka zapadnog sveta do sukoba sa zapadom. Druga knjiga u ponudi, Bosanska Golgota 1944-45. Sudbina 50.000 četnika iz Srbije, Bosne, Hercegovine i Crne Gore. Njihove poslednje velike bitke protiv partizana i ustaša. Sudbine komandanata i civila. Treća knjiga, Ravnogorke. Knjiga o jednoj od najmasovnijih ženskih organizacija u srpskoj istoriji ratovanja. Četvrta knjiga, Vojvoda Đujić i Dinarska četnička divizija. Biografija proslavljenog četničkog komandanta i istorijat njegove jedinice. Peta knjiga, roman Borački krš. Sudbina dve srpske porodice u vihoru Drugog svetskog rata. Svih 5 knjiga možete poručiti za samo 3.800 dinara. Poštarina je uključena u cenu. Poručbine na mail pogledi.kg@gmail.com. Potrebno je da navedete vaše ime, prezime, adresu i broj mobilnog telefona.
The Serbian army had fewer conscripts than the enemy, which is the reason why it had to rely on special forces. The initiative of Colonel Mihailovic in fact meant a return to tradition. The Chetniks whom we see in this photo from the first decade of the 20th century played a great role at the time. The first Chetnik training camp was founded by Captain Vojislav Tankosic in 1908 in the town of Prokuplje. Units of 10 to 15 Chetniks were dispatched as guerrilla forces into the Serb-inhabited territory under Turkish control. On the eve of World War I, they grew in size to battalions of several hundred men. By then, another Chetnik training camp was formed in Valjevo. The effectiveness of Chetnik operations was noted, and in 1929, the General Staff issued secret instructions for Chetnik warfare. Draza Mihailovic became the expert in this field. His contribution to military theory is the elevation of special Chetnik or guerrilla units to the strategic level. While previously these units had only a tactical role, Mihailovic held that, when required, the whole army should transform itself into a guerrilla force. Because of the bureaucrats like General Nedic, Mihailovic got to implement his idea the hard way. Until then, Nedic will once again make life difficult for Mihailovic. It was right after the fall of France in 1940. In response to German propaganda, the British military attaché in Belgrade organized a dinner with many invitees. The only officer who came in uniform was Colonel Mihailovic. Nedic took that as a provocation and reassigned Mihailovic to the opposite end of the country, to Mostar. All this took place far from the public eye. As with any generation, the public always reacts to war with surprise. That was the case in Belgrade in early 1941. War was far from the nation's mind. The Great Depression was already a distant memory. People were living carefree in relative prosperity. On the day the Axis invaded the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, April 6, 1941, Staff Colonel Draza Mihailovic was in Kiseljac, near Sarajevo, in the position of 2nd Army Chief of Staff, Operational Department. With his staff, he immediately went to Slavonia, where he was witness to the accuracy of his predictions. The Croat recruits were deserting the units en masse and crossing over to the Germans. The Germans were given a festive welcome not only in Croatia, but also in parts of Slovenia inhabited by German minority. The border fortifications constructed according to the plans drawn up by General Nedic proved to be completely worthless. In this situation, Colonel Mihailovic gathered Serbian units of the 2nd Army and withdrew to Bosnia, blowing up a bridge near Brčko on the Sava River. That was on April 12, 1941. At the order of the command of the 2nd Army, the following day in Gračanica, Colonel Mihailovic took command of a special unit, the Rapid Response Detachment, created for purposes of suppressing the insurgents of the Croatian armed bands, the Ustashi. During April 14, Mihailovic's detachment cleared Derventa and Bosanski Brod from the Ustashi. On April 15, the Rapid Response Detachment was fighting against the Germans the entire day in the village of Shevarlije, near Doboj. During a temporary calm in battle, a courier brought Mihailovic the order to cease hostilities as per truce terms. Failure to comply with the provisions entailed the death penalty. Upon seeing that a truce provision included the unconditional surrender of the armed forces, Mihailovic uttered the famous words, "Capitulation? That word does not exist in our language." While Mihailovic followed the spirit of General Putnik's teachings, Milan Nedic behaved in quite the opposite way. Being situated deep in the interior of the country, he never faced a single German soldier, but still delivered a defeatist speech to his men and soon thereafter returned to Belgrade. The Germans had not sent him to the POW camps as other captured officers. By the end of August, they installed him as the head of the German occupation government of Serbia. From that position, Nedic continues to pursue Mihailovic, now with German help. The Yugoslav government in exile stripped Nedic of his general's ranking. On April 20, Mihailovic's mountain detachment continued fighting against the Germans and the Ustashi, mainly in the area of Han Piesek. Finally, in late April, covering up his tracks to deceive the enemy, Mihailovic crossed the Drina River into Serbia with the remaining 150 men. On the slopes of Mount Tara, the Germans spotted his unit on May 3rd and attacked from two directions. Mihailovic destroyed the archive and ordered the unit to break up into smaller groups. Each group was tasked with organizing guerrilla units in their assigned regions. He brought with him 25 men, among whom were the remnants of the 1st Chetnik Battalion. The destination was Ravna Gora. It was reached on May 11th. To be precise, 23 had left for Ravna Gora, while Colonel Mihailovic, Major Palošević, and Sergeant Perović arrived in the evening of May 10th at the village of Struganik, at the foothills of the Ravna Gora mountain. The villa of the famous military leader from the Great War, Živojin Mišić, was located there. The general's original home still exists in Struganik. While the Germans burned the villa in December of that year in the course of Operation Mihailovic. The villa was located next to the creek below the general's original home. In the villa, Mihailovic met with the general's son, Major Aleksandar Mišić. They were old war comrades and friends. This is the postcard Aleksandar sent to Draza on July 17, 1915, during the Great War. Major Mišić approved of Colonel Mihailovic's plan of resistance, and the next day they went up to Ravna Gora together. As per existing military regulations, Mihailovic established the command of the Chetnik detachments of the Yugoslav army. Couriers were dispatched in all directions bearing the news that the fight continues until the final victory. The first guerrilla force in occupied Europe was formed. After some time, Mihailovic sent a courier to his family in Bregalnica Street in Belgrade. The courier was Milomir Sajic. In this picture we see him in Belgrade, disguised as a beggar. Posing as a beggar, he came to the gate of number 24 Bregalnica Street. The entire sum of 1941 was spent in the Mišić villa in Struganik by Mihailovic's wife Jelica, along with their 3 children, sons Vojislav and Branko and daughter Gordana. Three months before the aggression, the Reich Security Service has reported about the reforming Chetnik formations in 12 cities. In Slovenia, the Chetnik Association was established by Colonel Mihailovic personally.
Leta 1939, po anšlusu Avstrije, ko je Nemčija zasedla Avstrijo in ko so nemški nacisti praktično prišli na karavanke, takrat je prišel v Celje za komandanta 38. pešadijskega polka Draža Mihailovic. In on je začel zbirati okoli sebe, on in njegovi oficirji, recimo za nas konkretno je bil kapetan Vrebac, začel zbirati napredno mladino in napredne ljudi, predvsem pa rezervne oficirje, da jih je začel opozarjati na to, kakšna nevarnost nam preti. Severni del, od Save pa navzgor, je bil, boga mi, prežet z precej nemškimi elementi, odnosno ljudmi, ki so simpatizirali z nemškim tako zvanim novim redom. Ko sem napolnil 17 let, sem postal sokolčetnik. Za 17 leti. Mi smo imeli vaje z streljanjem z orožjem, metanjem bomb in tako dalje v oficirskem domu v Celju.
Croatian Ustaše groups were being trained in Hungary and Italy. They would surreptitiously break into Yugoslavia and perform terrorist acts. In September 1932, the Ustaše even raised a small armed uprising in Lika. For a proper understanding of future developments, it is of interest that the communists supported the uprising. Their party paper, The Proletarian, at the time published this. The Communist Party hails the Ustaše movement of Lika and Dalmatia peasants and is fully on their side. The communists were funded by the Soviet Union, and supporters of the Ustaše were financed by Germany, along with Italy and Hungary. On the eve of the World War, the British also had their favorites, the Chetniks. After the April War in 1941, the Germans were hurriedly transferring troops towards the Soviet Union. However, fearing an uprising in Serbian territories of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, they left behind 4 divisions in the occupied country. Parts of Serbia were soon to be occupied by 4 Bulgarian divisions. The Italians left 8 of their divisions. Northern Serbia was held by the Hungarian troops. Thus, in the spring of 1941, on the territory of the occupied Kingdom of Yugoslavia, there were about 220,000 Axis soldiers from the invasion force. Beginning in the following year, locals begin to enter the Axis formations. 1 SS division was composed of Banat Germans, 1 SS division was composed of ethnic Albanians from Kosovo and Metohija, 2 SS divisions were composed of Bosnian Muslims, and 3 SS Legionnaire divisions were made up of Croats. Units of the independent state of Croatia also participated in Wehrmacht operations, including, by the end of the war, almost all able-bodied Croats. Whilst in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941, there were about 220,000 Axis troops, in most other occupied countries the number of Axis soldiers was symbolic. In the Kingdom of Denmark, there weren't any troops at all, and the occupation was conducted by 200 German civilians. At the time, in Western Europe, primarily in France, there were about 600,000 Germans. In Greece, there were about 100,000 Germans and Italians. On the borders of the Soviet Union, there were more than 5 million Axis troops, which would, on June 22, 1941, launch Operation Barbarossa. Thus, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia had the 3rd largest number of Axis troops in Europe because of the expectation that the Serbs would continue with the war. This automatically meant that the name of the commander of the Serbs, as soon as he was to be known, would become famous throughout the world. However, before the world learned of his name, something else happened. By the end of summer 1941, Serbian parts of Yugoslavia became the 2nd highest in intensity of fightings against Germans, behind only the Eastern Front. The Chetniks liberated Loznica from the Germans on August 31, and that was the first free city in occupied Europe. In the following months, the Chetniks killed 196 and captured 500 Germans. They destroyed 4 and seized 2 German tanks, which would be used in an attack on the Germans' largest garrison in Kraljevo. In autumn, the Germans brought another 2.5 divisions from France and Greece, and the rebellion was crushed in cold blood. However, Europe and soon America also were desperate for good news. A mass uprising against Hitler somewhere in Europe was the best possible news. The name of the leader of the uprising was released by King Peter II Karađorđević of Yugoslavia, speaking over Radio London on December 1st, 1941. Shortly after, the Free French radio broadcast the first affirmative story about Mihailovic. The French likened Mihailovic, who on December 7 became a general, to General Charles de Gaulle for his courage and innovations in the art of warfare. French radio reports were being widely broadcast by the media throughout the free world. At that time, General Mihailovic and his Chetniks were the focus of attention. Typical is the article in the New York Herald Tribune on February 13, 1942, in which General James T. Brown said in a speech, "Perhaps we Americans need, despite all our strength in manpower and industry, some of that Serbian spirit, which proved to be so effective without any military power and weapons." The legend of General Mihailovic and the Chetniks was based essentially on accurate information. However, the legend also persistently omitted much other information. If that had been published also, it would have completed the picture of the war in the Balkans. But then that war couldn't so effectively be used to raise morale in occupied European nations and in lonely Britain and America, which had just made the first and most difficult step, entering the war. What was the other information? First of all, the Autumn Serb uprising against the Germans was actually the second Serbian uprising in World War II. The first, which was more important for the Serbian nation, broke out in the spring of that year. It was an uprising of Serbs trying to preserve their existence in Hitler's puppet state, the independent state of Croatia. Genocide of Croatian forces against Serbs, Jews and Roma was so horrible that it appalled even German and especially Italian officers.
Hvatali su najpozvanije ljude, recimo naše sveštenika, pa učitelje, pa one koji su radne na železnici, tako dalje. Iz Srpske Moravice je puno, ja mislim da je oko 80 ljudi odvedeno.
Na Svetoga Iliju Ustaše su uvrtle oko 300 ljudi i držali su u gradu Plaškome. I preko noći na Svetoga Iliju prevezli su u Saborsko. Evo ovdje ima i u Saborskom gdje su ubijali, to nije daleko od njihove crkve. I tu su pobili sve ljude. I među tim ljudima zadnja dvojica baš su bili komšija, pokojni Bogdan i pokojni Dragan. Ovaj Dragan iskočio iz kamiona i počeo bežati kroz žita i uvete ga u sječkovom glavu. I poslije su tu glavu držali na stalu i veselili se i pjevali. Mi smo to čuli, noć je tiha bila.
Serbs had been resisting since April. The first organized mass uprising started at the beginning of June 1941 in Herzegovina. Soon the uprising spread to Bosnia, Lika and Dalmatia.
Za vreme ustanka to je narod se digao i motikom i lopatom i svačim, nije bilo oružja. Možda na 100 ljudi jedna puška bila.
Na primjer, bio je ovaj Prota Radovan Jakšić, on je bio taj koji je nas organizovao. Nije on je bio onda bogoslov, nije bio Prota, ali posle postao. On nas je organizovao i tako smo počeli.
News about the genocide in the independent state of Croatia reached London as soon as the summer of 1941. It was largely ignored on the grounds that disclosure would badly affect morale in the fight against the Nazis. Unfortunately, it was soon followed by another series of news items. That was about the horrible crimes committed in the German-occupied zone in Serbia. Hitler personally signed an order that for every German soldier killed, 100 Serbs were to be executed, and for every German soldier wounded, 50 were to be executed.
Konsekvence so bile pa strahotne. Slovenija tega ni poznala. V Srbiji za enega nemškega padlega vojaka bilo pobitih 100 Srbov. In to ne da bi zbiral. Grupa v vasi ali grupa v mestu pobrali od fantov, dekleta že bolj malo, ampak od fantov do starih mož, ki so komi hodili, v vrsto pred zid postreliti. Gotovo.
In Kragujevac, the Germans even brought pupils out from their classroom and shot the entire class of the grammar school for boys on October 21st, 1941. On that day in Kragujevac, they executed 2,272 Serbs. 7 days earlier, in the neighboring Kraljevo, they executed 1,738 men and 19 women. In Shabac, the Germans shot 2,100 Serbs. By the end of the war, in the occupational zone in Serbia, the Germans had executed about 70,000 Serbs.
In the village of Oradour alone,
Serbian victims of Nazism were not only concealed during the war, but are still not acknowledged to this day. Thus, an example of the biggest Nazi reprisals in one day, in one place, the village of Oradour in France, is usually cited. In this village, the Germans killed 642 French civilians. Unlike the Jasenovac concentration camp in Croatia and Serbian cities like Kragujevac, Kraljevo and Shabac, where in one day much more than 642 civilians were massacred, the village of Oradour in short time became known throughout the world. The first reason was that the massacre in Oradour happened in 1944, while the greatest suffering of Serbs took place in 1942. In fact, while at the beginning of the war, the Western Allies were motivated to downplay victims of the Nazis, in the last phase of the war, the opposite process took place. The Nazi victims were emphasized. At that time, the number of Serbian victims was still rising, although victims from previous periods could be cited. This wasn't done because at the same time, another series of events for General Mihailovic and his army was playing out. It was a civil war against the communists.
That was the big day.
When, on the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler broke the pact with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin ordered all communist parties in occupied countries to rise and tie down Axis troops, thus slowing down the Axis war machine. This instruction, in practice, mostly benefited Hitler. It implied that in each of the occupied countries, communists were to set up their own armed forces. But where the regular army had survived, as in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, this meant that the communist provoked civil war would impede resistance to the Nazis. Indeed, by the end of July 1941, in Serbia, armed groups of the communists appeared. They proclaimed that their aim was the violent, revolutionary overthrow of the government and not just resistance to the occupiers. In practice, they did not spend much of their resources on the second of these priorities, focusing instead on the revolution. After the genocide in the independent state of Croatia, it was the worst thing that Colonel Draza could expect. Putting communists under his command, or any compromise, was not possible, and as early as the autumn of 1941, it was clear that a civil war had broken out. The civil war of communists against the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was just a new piece of bad news in a series of bad news that the Allies did not want to hear. More specifically, this news was even worse than that about the Nazi victims. For the Western leaders, the Axis attack on the Soviet Union was greeted with great relief. Primarily, it meant that Hitler gave up on the invasion of Great Britain. Instead, it caused new alliances. Instead of treacherous Hitler, Stalin now wanted a pact with the Western powers. First Britain, and then America eagerly accepted the pact. Under the impression of mass slaughter of their armies in World War I, London and Washington immediately made plans to minimize their own losses in the new conflict. The basic idea of these plans consisted of encouraging the Soviet Union to accept the main burden of the fights against the Axis. And this plan was put in practice. While the US had 270,000 and Britain 300,000 casualties, the Soviet Union had 9 million dead soldiers.
In their hour of peril, the Russian people turned for leadership to their prince, Alexander Nevsky.
Encouraging the Soviet Union meant a lot of things, from recording films about Russian history, such as the one we see, to providing huge logistical aid by ship convoys across the North Sea and political support for the communists around the world, including Sweden. In August 1942, a newsletter of the Communist Party of Sweden first negative article about General Mihailovic. This article was shared by communist media in other countries. And then, one by one, the neutral media also. During 1943, Mihailovic became a negative hero in the British media as well. This wave of negative publicity swept America last. In fact, it never reached America to the full extent. While the Western world was taking notice of only one dimension of the work of General Mihailovic, he himself had to take into account all aspects of the war dramas in the Balkans. His army was anti-German, but when the genocide in independent state of Croatia started, he shifted the focus of action in that direction. However, Croatia was a most loyal ally of Hitler in the Balkans, and so this decision of Mihailovic's fit in with the overall objective of the war effort. Thus, on December 22, 1942, he wrote to the Yugoslav government, "By destroying Pavelić's Croatia, I'm hitting the nerve artery of our greatest enemy, the Germans." However, the opening of another front, and the third in a row against the communists, carried more severe consequences. What General Mihailovic did by opposing the communists, every Allied general would have done the same. That is because the army is obliged to defend the constitution and its citizens from the terror of paramilitary organizations. The only difference between Mihailovic and Western generals lies in the fact that they never had to face communist revolutionaries. However, even with such a burden, General Draza Mihailovic presented an acute problem for the Germans, as the Chetniks were the largest and best organized guerrilla force. Photos of one of his units is enough evidence to prove that. No other guerrilla in occupied Europe can produce photos like these. The southernmost Mihailovic unit was the Bitolj Brigade, and northernmost, the Ljubljana detachment, 1,000 kilometers away from Bitolj in Macedonia. All units were connected by a system of over 100 radios. Radio stations were made by local engineers. They looked simple, but worked in all conditions. British historian Heather Williams said, "This was a surprise for British officers, who usually had the most severe problems trying to establish contact with resistance movements." In addition, only Mihailovic's guerrillas had their own radio station, which broadcast its program 3 times a day and even raided into the frequency of Radio Belgrade. The music program was broadcast live, as shown in this photo. The Chetniks had several workshops like this one in eastern Serbia, which made hand grenades. In these workshops, American heavy Browning machine guns were stripped from the aircrafts that were shot down by the Germans and then modified for use in ground warfare. The Chetniks had a postal service and even printed postage stamps. There were also amateur theatre troops. On the free territory, trains were operating and there were trucks and cars. The town that had been free for the longest period since 1942 was Srbac in western Bosnia. The largest free territory was located in eastern Serbia, dominated by the mountain Rtanj, with its famous pyramid-shaped summit, 1,500 meters high. Small towns under Rtanj, Sokobanj in the south and Boljevac in the east, were liberated at the end of 1943 and in the spring of 1944 respectively.
U Slobodnom Boljevcu leta 1944. godine održano je više defileja četničkih trupa snimljenih filmskom kamerom. Jedan od tih defileja bio je upravo ovom ulicom i iz tog doba ostala je jedna zgrada, ova žuta zgrada koju vidimo na levoj strani.
Since the end of 1943 until the autumn of 1944, Sokobanya was the location of the most modern hospital that the Chetniks were using. From the documents, we see that on July 28, 1944, an American pilot was operated on in Sokobanya. He had parachuted from a plane that was hit by a German shrapnel. He was operated on in this building, which still serves as a hospital today. When all is taken into account, what are the merits of General Mihailovic for his people and country, as well as for the Allied cause? Firstly, it is his participation in the war against the independent state of Croatia. As soon as he learned of the genocide, Mihailovic began sending officers, money, food and units over the Drina River. They created safe zones free of the Ustashi, especially in the mountains. If there was no other solution, the Chetniks were transporting people to the eastern bank of the Drina River. Some of the atmosphere of these rescues we can see in this dramatic photo.
I odmah počinje, pokolj je počeo u Bosni i Hercegovini i moj otac počinje da prikuplja nezarobljene oficire i podoficire i šalje ih na Ravnu Goru, s Ravne Gore u Bosnu da zaštite narod od pokolja. Tako je, na primjer, došao Boško Todorović kod nas i moj otac mu je dao neke lažne isprave da bi on otišao u Bosnu.
Along with Serbs, General Mihailovic's Chetniks also rescued Jews, first by introducing them into their organization. In Mihailovic's HQ, there were 3 Jews, a chef, a doctor, and a signaler. Jews were present in almost all units.
Mika Lektres je imao radionicu cipela po meri koja se nalazila u Palati Albaniji. Bio je četnik u odredu vojvode Vuka u Balkanskim i u Prvom svjetskom ratu. I on je, kad su počeli da Nemci u jesen 1941. da prikupljaju sve Jevreje u Beogradu, on je tada pobegao kod Draže. Sa porodicom, sa ženom i sinom. On je iz Italije otišao u Izrael i u Izraelu do kraja života davao parotos svake godine Draži Mihailoviću u Ruskoj crkvi u Tel Avivu. Bio sam na njegovom grobu i razgovarao sam sa njegovim sinom i sa snajom. I na grobu, to je interesantno, na grobu, sad me podsjetiste, na grobu je imao četničku kokardu na kamenu. Naravno, Davidova zvezda, a dole četnička kokarda.
Alexander Eisenberg, then a boy, with his mother managed to reach eastern Serbia. However, the Chetniks had a tip that Alexander's mother, Greta, is a Gestapo spy. An investigation was launched and the matter was cleared up. She admitted that their personal documents are false because they were Jews.
The Chetnik, on my surprise, took off his hat, made a cross, and said, "Lady, thank to Almighty God that you confessed. We are the army, King's army, under the command of Draza Mihailovic, and we are not pursuing Jews. We are not only an army that did not surrender, but we cannot believe you because we got information that a Gestapo woman with a child is coming. So we cannot believe you now, cannot trust you. You will be a certain time our," and he didn't know what to tell our guests, "until our people in Belgrade get necessary information." And one day came that Chetnik, he was an officer, because they didn't have any signs of their rank, with one who was evidently an higher officer, and said, we got the information, all that you told us is true, and he gave me a soldier's cap, shaikacha, with the emblem of the pre-war army, and said, listen, you are now a king's soldier. I was very proud. And you will be under our protection.
Another merit of General Mihailovic and his Chetniks is tying down Axis troops. Because of the Chetniks in the territory of occupied Yugoslavia, at least 4 German divisions were stationed. Moreover, also because of the Chetniks, Bulgaria was the only member of the Axis which did not participate on the Eastern Front. In exchange, the Germans ordered Bulgarians to occupy eastern parts of Serbia. At the request of the UK government, the Chetniks conducted several thousand diversions and acts of sabotage on railways and rail transports which were supplying Field Marshal Rommel's Africa Corps. Namely, one of the shortest paths for supplying German troops in Africa went through Serbia, and the battle against Rommel was even called the Battle for Supplies. One of the targets of the Chetnik sabotage activities was the largest copper mine in Europe, located in Bor.
Iz Paračina je šla železnica ozkotirna proti borskemu rudniku, proti Zaječarju. Borski rudnik je bil takrat strateško ogromnega pomena za Nemce, zaradi pridobivanja bakra. Ker brez bakra ni šlo. No in na tej progi smo mi imeli stalne diverzije. Zdaj pa. Parkrat se je zgodilo, da smo skretnico recimo, ali pa progo razdrli, ali omehčali, da je šlo vse skupaj dol.
General Mihailovic had 100,000 men under arms, and on the mobilization list there were another 400,000 men. This vast army should have been activated in the last phase of the war after obtaining weapons from the Allies. Anticipating this moment, General Mihailovic continually conducted a so-called low-intensity war against the Axis. According to a study by the US Department of Defense, based on the confiscated German documents, only in the first 3 months of 1943 on the territory of the German occupation zone in Serbia, there was 985 incidents, including sabotages, attacks on officials and police, as well as smaller German and Bulgarian units and military installations. In September 1943, when after the capitulation of Italy, he expected an Allied landing in the Balkans, General Mihailovic ordered the transition from guerrilla warfare to frontal warfare. Axis garrisons were destroyed from Zvornik in the north to Podgorica in the south, and from Zlatibor in the east to the vicinity of Sarajevo in the west. The Battle of Visegrad on October 5, 1943, remains embedded in memory. Many Chetniks fell on the historic old bridge, but the city was liberated from the Germans and Ustashi. Even bloodier battles took place in Rogatica, which the Chetniks liberated from the Germans in the Ustashi 7 days later. This Chetnik offensive against the Axis was stopped at Sokolac, when the Chetniks were attacked by the communist partisans from the rear. That happened on October 2nd, 1943. Allied landings were never materialized in the Adriatic, and General Mihailovic returned to guerrilla warfare. During September and October 1943, he was successfully commanding large units on a broad front. The main issue, not only for the fate of General Mihailovic, but ultimately for the fate of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, was who would get to the Balkans first, the Western Allies or the Red Army. It was clear that in the first case the country would remain democratic, while in the second it will descend into communist dictatorship. Until May 1943, all seemed fine, despite the fact that Western media were favoring the communists. The Red Army was far off, while the Allies were only 200 kilometers away. on the other side of the Adriatic Sea. On May 7, 1943, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden returned from Washington to London as preparations for the third conference between Churchill and Roosevelt were completed. Eden informed the Americans about the plan on further advance of Allied troops from southern Italy, that one wing should invade the Balkans and the other wing should go into southern France. British diplomats believed that President Roosevelt and his colleagues would accept this plan. Therefore, London intensified work on the plans for the invasion of the Balkans, which relied heavily upon the Chetniks.
The President of the United States welcomed the Prime Minister of Great Britain.
The Third Washington Conference took place from May 12 to May 25, 1943.
That night in the White House, where the
Winston Churchill argued with his famous thesis that the Balkans is the soft underbelly of the Axis. The Germans did not fortify the Balkans as they did Normandy, and besides, the Balkans had a strong Chetnik guerrilla movement. However, Roosevelt insisted on landing in Normandy. Churchill was persistently refusing Roosevelt's proposal, saying that in that case the English Channel would be turned into a river of blood because of strong German defenses. He believed that the defense of Normandy would weaken if German forces came to be stretched on two new fronts, in the Balkans and in the south of France. A compromise was not found. All new operations were suspended during 1943. The invasion of Normandy was planned for May 1st, 1944. Prolonged passivity of the Allies on the European front from May 1943 until May 1944 sent a very bad message to Stalin. Indeed, as soon as he heard of the decisions reached at the Third Washington Conference, Stalin withdrew his ambassadors from Washington and London. The Red Army already had disproportionately high losses, and Moscow now more than ever considered its Western partners as disloyal allies. The withdrawal of Soviet ambassadors from the two leading Western capitals was the lowest point in their relations. In the West, it was believed that Stalin's next step could even be a new pact with Hitler, in which case it would be the Nazi and Communist armies allied against the Western Allies. The stakes were high. Before Stalin could have learned the decisions of the Washington Conference, Churchill took drastic measures. Instead of going to London from Washington, he went to the Allied Command for the Mediterranean. From there, he issued two orders. First, to immediately send a military mission to Yugoslav communists. Second, that General Mihailovic is to immediately withdraw from 2/3 of his territory, leaving that territory to the communists. May 28, 1943 was the most dramatic day at the headquarters of General Draza Mihailovic. First, from London, he received a draft agreement on cooperation with the Allied troops during the upcoming invasion of the Balkans. The headquarters burst into a general celebration because that was the most joyful news since the outbreak of the war. This draft agreement was sent by the British government, which still did not know about the decisions of the Third Washington Conference. Only a few hours later, the British liaison officer, Colonel William Bailey, conveyed to General Mihailovic the order just received from Allied Command of the Mediterranean, that he should withdraw all his units east of the Koponic Mountains. Later still, General Mihailovic learned that on that day, May 28, 1943, the Communist headquarters received their first British military mission. The aim of these drastic measures by Churchill was to encourage Stalin to continue war against Hitler. All these measures were messages to Stalin that at the end of the war he will also get the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Until then, Stalin had not even asked for it, but demanded that the Western Allies acknowledge his conquests made while he was on the non-aggression pact with Hitler. Of course, Churchill believed that this message to Stalin was only a ruse. and that at the end of the war, the Balkans would not be handed over to the communists. But on this day, May 28, 1943, the genie was out of the bottle. After 3 days of deliberations with his associates, General Draza Mihailovic answered the British. He accepts the plan of invasion of the Balkans, but the decision to leave 2/3 of the territory is a question for the king and the government. At the same time, General Mihailovic wrote to the president of the Yugoslav government, Slobodan Jovanovic. To friends and foes, we proudly proclaim that we will never betray our ideals, although we are totally abandoned. I would like to emphasize, my soldiers and I did not recognize the capitulation the enemy has imposed, and we will certainly not capitulate to our allies. We will continue to fight against the Axis forces the best we can, as we have been fighting until now, despite the fact that the current Allied aid was so small it cannot be otherwise regarded than propagandist. With all aid I've received so far, I could not equip more than 200 to 300 soldiers. The British politician who was most often in contact with the Yugoslav government was George Rendel. In fact, he was the ambassador of Great Britain to the Yugoslav government, which was located in London. After the events of May 28, 1943, Rendel resigned. It was all the more galling to implement official policy, Rendel wrote in his memoirs, adding, "I was all the more disturbed by the anti-Mihailovic tone that seemed to thread through all our discussions on Yugoslavia."
When we saw Mr. Churchill come in, not puffing his cigar...
Later, Churchill withdrew the order to hand over 2/3 of the free territory to the Yugoslav communists. This order would otherwise be impossible to implement, because then there was only about 25,000 partisans in the whole country. However, Britain had continued to act in the spirit of the events of May 28, 1943. How Mihailovic was commanding units from his HQ on Ravna Gora via the radio stations is shown in this secret map of the intelligence services. The map is only partially correct because it does not include all Chetnik units. However, although incomplete, this map is proof that the British knew that General Mihailovic controlled a much larger territory than the communists. But from mid-1943 onwards, British radio stations were repeating that Tito's partisans were 10 times larger and more numerous than Draza's Chetniks. General Charles Armstrong, the new chief of the Allied mission to Mihailovic's HQ, was in charge of the in-the-field implementation of the new British policy towards the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. As a professional officer, General Armstrong executed the orders received. However, he used every opportunity to express his protest to his command. Thus, from the hills in western Serbia, General Armstrong, on November 26, 1943, sent the following telegram to the Allied command of the Mediterranean. "My position here is a travesty. I demand actions from Mihailovic, but cannot offer anything in return for enemy retaliations, which will inevitably follow." As the orders got more absurd, the general's voice rose up against his superiors. This is his dispatch from December 21, 1943. "I want to point out the serious errors in the methods you used to break Mihailovic. Every day you make my relations with Mihailovic more and more miserable. I know the man, not you." In one report signed together with Colonel Bailey, General Armstrong said, "Mihailovic and the Yugoslav Central National Committee believe that the total Serb losses in this war are exceeding 1 million people. Futile are the attempts to shake this belief by means of propaganda, especially when we take into account the recent cases of cooperation between the partisans and the Ustashi." cooperation between the communists and the Ustashi dated back to the pre-war era. The leaders of both parties were Croats, and their cooperation was aimed against the Chetniks, who were mostly Serbs. When it became clear that the Axis were losing the war, the Ustashi were massively deflecting to the partisans. If he could somehow understand why the Western media did not publish news about the mass killings of Serbian civilians, now General Mihailovic could definitely not accept the fact that the Allies ignored the cooperations of partisans and Ustashi. Therefore, from January to May 1944, he refused to receive General Armstrong. In late May, Armstrong left Serbia from the airport in the village of Pranjani, which Chetniks arranged for the evacuation of rescued Allied pilots. Colonel Bailey had already felt the firm position of General Mihailovic. When the promised Allied arms shipment did not arrive, General Mihailovic would send Colonel Bailey into the so-called dunce backseat. This meant Bailey would not ride at the head of the column with Mihailovic and other senior officers, but at the back with the supplies.
Fortresses from the west went forth to destroy enemy bases in Italy. Sardinia.
The groundbreaking event in the attitude of General Mihailovic to the Allied forces took place in September 1943, regarding the capitulation of Italy. The Allies not only did not inform Draza that Italy signed the surrender, but also ordered the Italians to provide weapons to the communists and not the Chetniks. On this occasion, Colonel Bailey informed the Allied command of the Mediterranean. "I feel that his, Mihailovic's, silence is unnatural, but I have to admit he was really angry." At that time, there were a large number of Allied missions in Chetnik units. General Draza had ordered all his officers to continue to treat the Allies warmly, but now to keep them at arm's length. In the defense of national interests, he did not give an inch. Similarly, Mihailovic and his officers adhered to international law till the end, which the Allies violated by establishing contact with the illegal Communist Party. There was an arrangement between Western leaders and Stalin that the Red Army would at the same time vigorously attack the Germans from the east. Now, however, Stalin began to change his tactics. He slowed the advance of his troops, and when the Red Army came to Warsaw, he suspended all operations. Thus, the Germans massacred the Polish resistance movement. After that, Stalin ordered the offensive not to the west, but to the south, towards the Balkans. On these maps, we can see the advances of the Red Army in September and October of 1944. While on the way to Berlin, the front lines are almost not moving at all. In the south, the Red Army suddenly burst into Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. Thus, Stalin's army advances more on the south than on the main front. Churchill was not expecting that. He believed that the Balkan countries will remain in the Western sphere of interest. But now he saw the Soviet Union, after the expulsion of the Germans, was installing communist regimes in the Balkans. What Churchill feared the most was the possibility that the Red Army would extend to Greece. In this way, after the war, trade routes in the Mediterranean would be endangered. In October 1944, Churchill urgently goes to Moscow with the goal of saving Greece. Then he signed with Stalin the notorious document on the division of zones of influence. On a piece of paper, Churchill wrote in percentages. Romania, Soviets 90%, West 10%. Greece, Soviets 10%, West 90%. Yugoslavia, Soviets 50%, West 50%. However, the Yugoslav 50-50 remained only on paper. The communists went in behind Soviet tanks, raised their five-pointed Red Star flag in Belgrade, and stayed there for more than half a century. The first units of the Red Army crossed the Danube on September 4th, 1944. That day, north of Churchill, the War Parliament of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was in session. On hearing of the news, the speaker, Dr. Mihailovic, suddenly died. General Mihailovic remained in good spirits for exactly 8 days. The reason were the words of the US Colonel Robert McDowell, the head of a new military mission at his headquarters. This was before a rapid penetration of the Red Army into the south. Not expecting the penetration of the Red Army, the superiors gave McDowell instructions concerning the negotiations with the Germans about the surrender in the Balkans. McDowell informed Mihailovic about this. The plan was that Germans would surrender to the Chetniks and to a smaller US unit. This would prevent the Bolshevization of Yugoslavia. This sudden burst of the Soviets over the Danube, McDowell initially viewed as a solitary incident which would not hinder the outcome of the war. However, when 414,000 Red Army troops crossed the Danube, McDowell was ordered to return to Italy. The American colonel delayed his departure until November 1st. At his departure from the airport in Bojanic in Bosnia, he could only offer to take Mihailovic with him to save his own life. General Mihailovic thanked him and said, "Homeland is not worn on the soles of one's shoes."
On je bio hrabar čovjek. Ja sam par puta ovako video i ta situacija, kažem, kad su oni šrapneli pucali tamo, kad su se smejali ovi ljudi koji su prošli Prvi svjetski rat, kakva je to, nema veze, jel? Ako je bilo napad avionski, on je posljednji išao u zaklon.
In tam sem v Hampijesku je bila zelo težka borba z Ustaši in sem komaj živo glavo odnesel. In tam smo bili potem postrojeni, točno vas, katere jaz se ne spomnim. Tam me je Draža Mihailovic povišal v čin poročnika, je pristopil k meni, že skoraj šel naprej, pa se vrnil nazaj. Jesi ti Slovenac? Jaz sem gospodine generale. A kako ti je prezime? Gospodine generale, podporučnik Uroš Šušterić, takrat sem podporučnik. Jesi ti sin Josa Šušterića? Jaz sam, Boga mi. E pa ti si sin moga ratnog druga i prijatelja.
Tada pređemo i to je bilo te noći, sad skupljamo se na drugoj strani, ja isto mokar, pored Draže. I tako se i probudim ujutru kako sam se bio na njega naslonio.
Iz istega kotla smo jedli. Je prišel zvečer, on tako tisto žlico izpod škornov potegnil. Rekel, junaci, jer ima i za mene malo. Seveda nam narodno. Izvolite, gospodine general.
Behu detin ocevi. Decembar, valjda, 44. I sad pred polazak marša ja pritrčim i vežem u noge. Ocevi. I on se razvezuje. Znaš šta kaže? Ne mogu sad ništa, ali posle rata što god budeš hteo, dobit ćeš.
Nije mi dao poklon, ali uvek kad me vidio da sam ja tamo negde, pa znate, onako malo stidljivo obilazim njegovu šatru, a on uvek kaže, dovedite mi tog dečaka. I onda me uvek pitao kako si, čuvaj se, budi pametan, budi mudar.
Izvanredan. Jedan utisak jednog fantastičnog i oficira, i borca, i intelektualca. I skromnog čoveka. Znate, uopšte nije odavao utisak nekog tako nadobudog komandanta, znate, koji naređuje okolo.
To je bil, torej jaz šele zdaj vidim, kako velik lik je bil ta človek.
On je išao u pantalonama nekim koje su bile gore nego ove moje sada, znate. Uniforma je bila ona engleska, standardna, nije bila otrcana, ali ni izdaleka nije bio neki nešto gizdao, nešto posebno, nešto ekstra. Njegovog konja jahali su svi, pa i ja. On najmanje on.
After May 28, 1943, the toughest day for General Draza Mihailovic was September 12, 1944. On that day, King Petar gave his traditional birthday speech over Radio London. The King's birthday was celebrated on September 6th, but this time the speech is delayed by 6 days. That's how much time Churchill needed to persuade the King of what he was about to announce. Over the radio waves, the King called upon his army to join the ranks of the communists.
Ali nikada nije padao u vatru, nikada nije, eto jedino tada kad je čuo kraljev govor 12. septembra, tada ga je čuo moj prvi zet da je opsovao. Inače to nije psovao.
Indeed, this was a unique situation in the history of warfare, because the first item in the communist agenda was the overthrow of the king, which they had announced long before this day. The Chetniks and General Draza, who was sworn to defend the king's throne, was sensing this outcome for the last 6 months, but it was not possible to prepare for such a consequence.
Ovo je jedna kuća iz toga doba, slična onoj u kojoj se general Mihailović nalazio uveče, pa sve do ponoći 12. septembra 1944. godine. Iznad podruma je gostinska soba i on je sedeo u jednoj takvoj sobi. U neposrednoj blizini nalazilo se jedno ovako drvo. Na tome drvetu neprekidno su se smenjivala 3 oficira i podoficira posmatrajući generala Mihailovića. Mislili su da će on da se ubije. Istovremeno, jedan čovjek bi uvijek stajao pored vrata i netremice posmatrao onog na drvetu. Ako bi general Mihailović počeo da vadi pištolj iz futrole, čovjek sa drveta dao bi znak ovome pored vrata i on bi utrčao i pokušao da oduzme pištolj generalu Mihailoviću. To je trajalo dugo, svakako više od 5 sati. General Mihailović je sedeo nepomično, sem što je pušio cigaretu za cigaretom na svojoj muštikli i pio rakiju. Nešto pred ponoć je lagano ustao, podigao bačenu šajkaču sa poda i dugo posmatrao kokardu. Onda je poljubio kokardu, stavio šajkaču na glavu i izašao. Rekao je samo jednu reč, pokret. Šajkaču koju je nosio general Mihailović napravio je Milomir Sajić. On je sačuvao kalup na kome je pravio šajkače. Više od 6 decenije kasnije on je na tom kalupu napravio i jednu šajkaču koju mi je poklonio. To je ova šajkača.
Mihailovic, however, would not surrender. The next day he sent the following announcement to all commanders. The king's speech is a complete fabrication. We were informed earlier by our politicians from abroad that this may happen, but we did not believe that the Allies would have enough courage to do it. In addition to the denial of the authenticity of the king's speech, Mihailovic said that the order pronounced on the radio was not valid. Also, it was proclaimed that the king is under house arrest. The new motto was, "The king is a prisoner, long live the king." In those difficult times, Draza thought of his teacher, Field Marshal Putnik. Everything he did was in the spirit of the Field Marshal's Academy. He remembered his son, Colonel Dmitry Putnik. He was one of the most important of Mihailovic's officers abroad. Now, General Mihailovic appoints Dmitry Putnik as his aide and eventually his successor, looking forward to his returning to the homeland. Colonel Putnik accepts this invitation with enthusiasm. However, the Allies thwarted his return and he remained abroad. In mid-September 1944, Mihailovic's army is halved. With the rest of the units, he retreats to the west towards Bosnia, away from the Red Army. Before he crossed the Drina River on September 18th, he hears tragic news. Communists had captured 2 of his 3 children, son Branko and daughter Gordana.
Na jednoj slici vidimo Gordanu Mihailović sa 3 četnika. Gordana nosi bombu za pojasom. Sliku mi je dao jedan od te 3, Mijalko Perišić iz Kosjerića. On mi je rekao da je slika nastala početkom septembra 1944. i da je zadatak te 3 bio da čuvaju Gordanu i Branka. Međutim, 18. septembra 1944. dok su se nalazili u jednoj uvali ispod Ravne Gore, naišla je jedna velika grupa partizana i sve ih zarobila. Četnici su sakrili oružje i opremu i predstavili se kao čobani. To je jedino što su stigli da urade.
The communists publicly praised the capture of General Mihailovic's children, and the news was broadcast on the radio. However, a month and a half later, they changed their tactics. The newspaper Politika from October 31st, 1944, published an article titled, "The Children of Draza Mihailovic Renounce Their Unworthy Father." The article even said that they participated in the fight against the Chetniks and that they gave a statement against their father for the press. The article was illustrated with a photo in which they allegedly wrote the statement. However, the body language of Branko and Gordana reveals that they are under duress. 61 years has passed until Politika in 2005 published the denial of this article. This photo was taken on September 11th, 1944. General Mihailovic was still smiling. However, in photos taken after September 18th, 1944, we see big changes. On one photo, his shoulders are slumped. On another, we see large dark bags under his eyes. On a third, a sad face. However, not in a single document from that period is there a sign or even a glimmer of doubt from Draza Mihailovic that they wouldn't be victorious. When some officers proposed the withdrawal towards Italy, while it was still possible, he replied, "Our goal is not to escape, but to fight till the end." In May 1945 in central Bosnia, General Mihailovic had about 15,000 soldiers left. They were starving and ammunition was in short supply. The communists had artillery, tanks and air support and were far more numerous. On Orthodox Easter, May 6th, General Mihailovic sent out a holiday message to all his troops. In that brief but powerful message, he spoke for the first time about the resurrection and a heavenly victory for future generations which awaits those on the Christian path. The message reads, "We will continue to advance towards the goal that we have set for ourselves. At exactly 11 a.m., all columns will come to a halt wherever they may be. In remembrance of the day of the resurrection, we will pray to the Lord. The priests will conduct a brief divine service. After that, we move on. Our struggle and our suffering are for man's God-given rights. That is the path trodden by the Lord Christ, where he did suffer but was resurrected. The passage of time does not change or refute any of this. Neither will anything in our time. We may all perish in that struggle, but our victory is ensured, as well as prosperity for those who survive and future generations. I am confident of our determination to persevere to the end, and I greet you, my dear comrades, with Christ has risen." Indeed, he has risen, reverberated the Bitovnya mountain, and the columns continued their trek towards Serbia. The goal was the same as in May 1941, to instigate an uprising, but this time against the communists rather than the already beaten Germans. In the ensuing unequal battle of Zelengora on May 13, 1945, the bulk of Mihailovic's army was destroyed. The remaining soldiers were ordered to regroup and to prepare for an uprising. A series of minor skirmishes throughout eastern Bosnia ensued. In one of these skirmishes on May 24th, west of Rogatica, General Mihailovic's youngest son, Vojislav, was killed. Draza personally buried his own son. Most of summer in 1945, Draza spent in the area of Han Pjesak. Europe is at peace. But in the Serb regions of Yugoslavia, the Chetniks continuously lead the guerrilla war against the communist regime, which the people did not accept. There were far more Chetniks than the communists ever admitted or published. This photo, taken in the summer of 1945 on Mount Romania, shows that the Chetnik units were not low in morale. This was apparent by burning of fires on hills to celebrate the king's birthday, found in a secret report by the Communist Army, otherwise known as KNOI, from September 18, 1945. Fighting between Chetniks and communists was waged throughout Serbia. However, the largest Chetnik units were in Bosnia. For example, on September 13, 1945, 142 Chetniks attacked the communists on the Rogatica-Sokolac road, while the day before, 135 Chetniks attacked the communists in the village of Jabuka, north of Foča. In a new secret report by KNOI to the communist government, it is said, due to the very difficult situation in the sectors Majevica, Ozren, Trebova, Foča, Goražde, Čajnice, a stronger concentration of our units is required. It can be assumed that these attacks came on the orders of General Mihailovic, so the communist units would withdraw from the Drina River. The defense of Drina weakened, and the Rogatica Flying Brigade, under the command of Captain Radomir Nešković, defeated the communists. It was on September 20th, 1945, north of Visegrad. General Mihailovic, a year later, had returned to western Serbia. The last known order signed by General Draza Mihailovic is dated December 14, 1945. It is written on a typewriter, officially, properly, as if everything was all right. It was a command to establish a new order, the Cross of the King's Commandos. The order was accompanied by a sketch of the new medal. The most important words of this order are in the header, where it states that it is issued in the spirit of the authority of His Majesty the King. Here, once again, a sign from the teachings of Field Marshal Putnik, how a soldier should behave when the chain of command is interrupted. Draza was moving closer to Belgrade to achieve better communications with his contacts abroad. In the capital, like when it was under German occupation, a strong Chetnik underground existed, which had a courier service with Chetnik commanders and politicians from the kingdom, which were in Italy and in Switzerland. At the end of January 1946, General Miodrag Damjanovic, who was with 10,000 Chetniks in Italy, in Camp Eboli near Naples, sent a courier to General Mihailovic. The courier conveyed the request to General Draza to leave the country. He once more refused. A courier then arrived from Switzerland with a letter from Dr. Živko Topalović, president of the Socialist Party of Yugoslavia. His response to that letter is the last known paper written by Draza before capture. In the area around Bajina Bašta on February 2, 1946, Mihailovic wrote to Dr. Topalović as follows: I am aware of the impact an uprising would have under the present conditions. It will only become possible once there are no foreign troops in our country supporting the current terrorist regime of a small handful of Yugoslav and foreign communists. You know my ultimate goal is to sustain at all costs for the great task that awaits us. I'm not a man who will abandon his country and people at the first sign of danger. I may very well die in this sacred struggle, but my death will not signify the end of it. I am no more than a simple executor of the will of the people, and in that capacity, I initiated the fight against the occupiers and then against the communists. At that time, Draza was suffering from typhus. Conditions for treatment were appalling, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. Miraculously, he survived. Meanwhile, the British intelligence was trying to locate Mihailovic. Duško Popov was involved in the investigation. He would later become one of the world's most famous secret agents.
Sergej Živanović posle svega stigao je najkasnije tamo. Posle svega on stiže u Austriju. I odvode ih sve u jedan, razoružaju ih Englezi, engleska zona, Koruška, razoružaju ih Englezi i odvedu ih pred istragu za ratne zločine. Tu istragu vodi kao britanski pukovnik, pogodite ko?
Popov.
Tačno. Popov. Zvani triciklet. I Popov, osnovna pitanja su gde su ostavili Dražu. To mi je pisao Sergej Živanović koji mi je kum. Krstio je mog sina. Odjedanput Duško Popov nestaje odatle. I gde se preseljava? Preseljava se u Trst. A u Trstu se nalazi njegov rođeni brat, doktor Iva Popov, koji je za vreme rata bio glavni britanski agent MI6 u Beogradu. I imao radio stanicu. Početak zime 1945. On i Duško Popov u Trstu. I sačekuju ove naše koji su u ono vreme prelazili u Italiju i tako dalje. I prelazi major Ciga. Stojanović. Odmah su uhapsili Cigu Stojanovića, stavili ga u jednu samicu u kojoj je proveo 6 meseci. I tu je bila glavna tema gde je ostavio Dražu Mihailovića. Gde je ostavio Dražu Mihailovića?
I ko mi je to pričao?
Ciga.
In late autumn 1945, General Mihailovic contacted the British via the radio. In February 1946, when he fell ill, the communication was taken over by the officers from his HQ. According to the testimony of Major Milan Ciga Stojanovic, the British gave this radio connection to the communists in Belgrade, who continued to communicate undetected. The last place where General Mihailovic walked free was the village of Oskoruša on the mountain Varda near Priboj in Bosnia. He arrived there probably at the beginning of March 1946. The village was alive with people loyal to king and country, so there was no need for General Mihailovic to hide. Today, the village is almost deserted, with only a few elderly households. Oskoruša is still hard to reach, even in the summertime. The officers from Mihailovic's HQ agreed that he was temporarily to be evacuated to Italy until he gets better. A small British airplane, Percival Proctor, landed at the specified location and British officers came out of the plane. When the plane with Draza took off, the Chetniks were attacked by the communists. This happened on March 13, 1946. The British officers were in fact Yugoslav communists, led by Radoljub Milovanovic, who spent the war in the service of the British. US intelligence had reported on how General Mihailovic had been captured on June 1, 1946. This document confirms that in the area of Rudo, a seriously ill general was taken by planes with Allied markings. In July, the American press has extensively quoted this document. On August 17, this was published on the front page of the Swiss newspaper Journal Dividend. However, behind the Iron Curtain, these facts remained hidden for a long time.
U socijalističkoj Jugoslaviji nije se pričalo o tome da je svoje posljednje dane na slobodi general Mihailović proveo ovde, u selu Oskoruša, niti se znalo za pisanje strane štampe o tome kako je zarobljen. Ja sam prvi put o tome saznao od starog Dragoslava Hadžića iz sela Jablanica kod Gornjeg Milanovca 1990. godina. Njegov brat od tetke Radoslav Pavlović iz Mojsinja nalazio se upravo ovde u pratećoj jedinici generala Mihailovića. Pri ulasku u avion general Mihailović je svakome od svojih pratilaca dao po nekoliko zlatnika. Kada je avion otišao, njih su iznenada napali partizani.
While Oskorosha is inaccessible, Mount Varda has many grassy plateaus, some of which contain the word flat in its name. On military maps, looking at the contours, you can find locations suitable to land small planes.
Nalazimo se na jednoj zaravni koja je pogodna za improvizovano letelište kakvih u trouglu između Priboja, Rude i Višegrada možemo naći više. Ova vrsta letilišta pogodna je za lake klipne avione. Ja sam kao oficir avijacije za vrijeme školovanja u Vazduhoplovnoj vojnoj akademiji leteo na lakom motornom avionu i siguran sam da su ovakvi prostori potpuno bezbedni za poletanje i sletanje takvih aviona. Jugoslovenska armija, odnosno njeno ratno vazduhoplovstvo, 1946. godine u svom sastavu imalo je lake motorne avione za vezu britanskog porekla, Pensival Proctor, koje su osim pilota imale 2 mesta za prevoz putnika.
This is the first photo of the imprisoned General Draza Mihailovic.
Jednoga dana neki Milivoje Vuković, bio je upravnik tog zatvora, okružnog suda, uleti on i sav oduševljen, uhvaćen Draža. A jedan, ne poznajem ga, onako mrtvo ladno, kaže, pa šta? Uhvatili ste Dražu, pa ovdje, kaže, samo u ovoj sobi svaki od ovih možda bude drugi Draža. Onaj zalupi vrata, onaj štukator, samo što nije pao, od besa izlete napolje.
U Mitrovici, paviljon 4, kazneno-popravnog doma. Bio sam kazneno-popravnom domu. I tu su ljudi pričali, ja sam slušao. Pričali su to da je Dražo dobro uradio, što nije otišao i da je ostao među narodom.
In the communist secret police prison, Draza was drugged with mescaline and brutally tortured. It was part of the preparation for the so-called Stalinist process. During torture, a transcript for the future trial is made, with predetermined questions and answers. When the trial begins, the prosecutor will read the predetermined questions and the defendant is obliged to reply with the given answers. If these are not given, you are tortured again. All the accused were proclaimed traitors and criminals even before the process had started, as you can see in this clip, which was screened in cinemas at the time.
Počinje suđenje Draži Mihailoviću i grupi domaćih izdajnika, vinovnicima najsramnije izdaje i najtežih masovnih zločina izvršenih nad našim narodima u toku ovoga rata. Zahvaljujući međunarodnoj reakciji, general Draža Mihailović, izdajnik po direktivama londonske izbjegličke vlade, sluga okupatora u zemlji, predstavljan je u inostranstvu kao heroj oslobodilačkog rata u Jugoslaviji. Sud dolazi. Na čelu sa Dražom Mihailovićem ulaze optuženi.
Optuženi Mihailović Dragoljub Draža.
Mihailović Dragoljub Draža, ministar emigrantske kraljevske vlade, komandant takozvane jugoslovenske vojske u otadžbini, komandant četničkih odreda na terenu. U porobljenoj zemlji odmah su se našle sluge okupatora. Jedni su radili otvoreno, drugi prikriveno, a treći iz inostranstva dirigovali izdajom.
Like the villain in Dostoevsky's novel, who is constantly returning to the crime scene, so eventually he was discovered, the president of the court, Mihailo Đorđević, and the prosecutor, Miloš Minić, often returning exactly on what they wanted to hide, the question of torture in the investigation, subconsciously revealing their secret. The trial of General Mihailovic began on June 10, 1946, in the guardhouse in Belgrade. The next day, the judge, Đorđević, in one juncture consecutively, asked the four following questions. How were you treated while you were giving your statement? Were you mistreated, yes or no? Was your statement coerced? Did you refuse voluntarily or under coercion? All who knew Mihailovic noticed a big change in his physical appearance. Seeing in what condition Mihailovic was in, his defense counsels, Dr. Dragic Joksimovic and Dr. Nikola Jonovic, tried to convince the court that he was not ready for trial. However, this was to no avail. General Mihailovic's defense offered over 100 witnesses to the court. In the end, only 2 women appeared as defense witnesses. One was afraid and did not testify. The second was brave despite the constant shouting and insults by the prosecutor. Her name was Vidosava Trkuljac. She was 24 years old from Sremska Mitrovica. After her testimony, she left the courtroom and was never seen again. False witnesses were constantly summoned by the prosecutor. The court believed that everything they said was true. When responding to the prosecutor's questions, General Mihailovic began to speak, to say what had actually occurred. Then the prosecutor or the judge would interrupt him, asking him to return to the statement entered into the records. In most cases, Mihailovic said what the communists have previously entered into the records. But there were times when he did not want to, at any price. Thus, Mihailovic said that in August 1941, he personally, with his escort unit, attacked a group of partisans in the village of Planinica under Ravna Gora because they were robbing the peasants. The prosecutor asked for the names of the peasants so they can be brought to court to confirm that these partisans were actually bandits. I do not want to create difficulties for these peasants now, said Mihailovic. The second case relates to the question of who started the civil war in 1941. The judge claimed it was the Chetniks and asked the following question. Have you, the accused Mihailovic, given the order on November 1st, 1941 to your commanders to withdraw troops from the front line against the Germans and to mount a general attack against the partisans? General Mihailovic said, no, it was the other way around. Mihailovic showed his best form in his closing statement on July 10, 1946. Only then he was not interrupted. He spoke for over 6 hours, from 5 o'clock till 10 minutes before midnight, with only 2 15-minute breaks. In the end he said,
okružen sa svima mogućim obaveštajnim službama, inteligensa, gestapoa i svima mogućim obaveštajnim službama sveta. Ostao sam ipak na samovojnju, ubeđen da narod treba da da svoju reč na kraju. Ubeđen sam bio da sam na pravom putu i pozivao novinare celog sveta, tražio im misije Crvene armije. Sudbina je bila nemilosrdna prema meni, kad me bacili u ovakav vihor, najteži moguć koji može jednoga čoveka snaći. Sudbina je bila nemilosrdna do kraja. Mnogo sam hteo, mnogo sam započeo. Ali vihor svetski odneo je mene i moj rad.
U ime naroda, Vrhovni sud Federativne Narodne Republike Jugoslavije, Vojno veće osuđuje Mihailovića Dragoljuba Dražu na kaznu smrti streljanjem, trajan gubitak političkih i pojedinih građanskih prava i na konfiskaciju celokupne imovine.
General Mihailovic was executed at dawn, July 17th, 1946. On the same date, in 1918, the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas Romanov, was also executed along with his entire family. The location of General Mihailovic's execution is revealed by Petar Mičić, an attorney from Ivanjica and a friend of Judge Mihailo Mita Đorđević.
I Mita i ja bili smo na igranici toj u domu garde i on mi je rekao, ovde je bilo suđenje Draži Mihailoviću, u ovoj sali. Video sam salu ko što gledam vas. Mita mi je rekao, Draža je stalno bio u ovoj sobici ovde i pokazao mi jednu sobicu. Da li postoji to danas ili ne znam. Mika Đorđević kasnije mi je rekao da je, a znao sam da je on sudio Draži, ali on mi je rekao da ga nisu vodili u zatvor centralni koji su imali, ni dole kod Botaničke bašte u Beogradu, ni na Adu Ciganliju, nego ga zatvarali stalno u ovu sobu ovde i stražu su imali. Izvedu ga iz sobe na suđenje i kad završi suđenje vrati ga u sobu.
Sobica o kojoj je pričao Đorđević u stvari nije se nalazila u domu garde, već 50 metara iza u podzemnom skloništu koje je napravljeno uoči Drugog svjetskog rata. Tu je bio pravi mali podzemni grad sa mnogo spavaonica, kupatila, kuhinja itd.
While the general public entered the trial hearing through the front entrance, General Mihailovic was escorted through the back door. Through the same back door, Draza was also led back to the shelter. Entrance to the shelter still exists today. In fact, there are two entrances, which merge into one single underground hallway.
Da bi zavarali trag, komunisti su napravili lažnog generala Mihailovića. Njega je Marica svake večeri odvozila odavde do zatvora u Đušinoj ulici i svakog jutra su ga vraćali natrag.
General Draza was probably an individual with the most body doubles in World War II. Besides communists, the Germans also had doubles for Mihailovic and used him to approach and gain the trust of his supporters. However, the most doubles were created by General Mihailovic himself, mainly to deceive Germans in their efforts to locate him. The communists created Draza's double out of fear that Chetniks might attempt to free him. General Damjanovic, who was in Camp Eboli in Italy, had indeed sent his men to coordinate a plan to free Mihailovic.
Jedan od Damjanovićevih ilegalaca bila je Zagorka Vasić, koja mi je pričala o tome. Akcija ilegalaca nije uspela, ali komunisti su osjetili da se nešto sprema, pa su generala Mihailovića likvidirali tajno i na brzinu u zoru 17. jula 1946. čak pre nego što je istekao rok žalbe na smrtnu kaznu.
Ali mi je milo da mogu i to da kažem šta mi je ispričao lično predsjednik suda koji je sudio Draži Mihailoviću. Kaže, kad je ga osudio na smrt, onda su odveli ga u sobu tamo i on je lično raspitao se šta je dalje bilo, kaže da su ga tu ubili. Nemam pojma ni kako su ga ubili, ni čime, ni šta, samo znam da su ga iskasapili.
A photograph of the dead General Mihailovic was taken, 3 copies were printed, and all the negatives destroyed. However, General Damjanovic's agents still managed to obtain one of these copies.
Ta fotografija je objavljena u emigrantskoj štampi, pa je u Beogradu izbila velika afera oko toga. Fotografiju je general Damjanović poklonio Zagorki Vasić, a ona je poklonila meni, kada se 1993. godine vratila iz Amerike u Srbiju. Kada je 2009. godine osnovana državna komisija za pronalaženje groba generala Draže Mihailovića, ja sam komisiji predao fotografiju. Jedan gardista Titove garde otkrio je 1950. godina da je general Mihailović ipak sahranjen na padinama Lisičjeg potoka, ali iza ograde unutar dvorskog kompleksa na Dedinju. U poslednjoj godini svoga života, upravo kada je osnovana državna komisija za pronalaženje groba generala Mihailovića, taj gardista je nacrtao prilično preciznu mapu sa mestom groba. Dvorski kompleks na Dedinju je ogroman. Samo ova ograda na južnoj strani duga je skoro 2 kilometra. Ne možemo biti sigurni da je grob generala Mihailovića zaista unutra, ali verovatnoća je velika.
Josip Broz Tito sought a safe and secure place to bury his greatest enemy, a spot 100 meters away from the royal palace where Tito had just moved in. At the time, this would have been a logical choice. Many years later, even the State Commission failed to reach and explore this location. To this day, it is still under guard.
George Bernanos je kazao, danas je 16. juli, mi ćemo da legnemo da spavamo mirno, a presuda je doneta i sutra ujutru, pre nego što zora svane, general Mihailović, prvi gerilac Evrope, bit će streljan. On gine za sve nas, mi ćemo da uživamo plodove demokratije, a on će da bude u grobu. Eto, to su bile njegove reči. I to je fantastično odjek imalo. Fantastično. Jer reputacija Žorža Bernanosa na zapadu je bila ogromna.
General Mihailovic took the field and led the resistance in Yugoslavia at a time when there were no other effective resistance movements in Europe. He joined in his lot with England when she had no allies on the continent. He became engaged in a very brutal civil war with the partisans, his internal enemies. Nevertheless, he remained loyal to the Allies. The return of so many American airmen who were protected by his forces, though they were not being armed or supplied by the Americans or the British, their medical supplies were lacking, very few, but they shared everything they had with the American airmen. In my opinion, General Mihailovic was a loyal ally, and he deserved a far better fate than he received by being abandoned on the false charge that he was a collaborator.
The Americans must have contributed because of the way they abandoned Mihailovic. Certainly in retrospect, there's no doubt that was a huge mistake. And I think even American leaders realized that mistake pretty soon after the war. But by then, of course, it was too late to do anything.
Nova ponuda izdavačke kuće Pogledi. 3 toma knjige Miloslava Samardžića. General Draža Mihailović i opšta istorija četničkog pokreta. Najpotpunija i najobimnija biografija generala Draže Mihailovića. 3 toma, ukupno 1800 stranica. 3000 citiranih dokumenata, 400 originalnih fotografija. Sve velike bitke četnika protiv Nemaca, ustaša, partizana i drugih protivnika. Nemačke operacije protiv četnika i četničke operacije protiv Nemaca. Brojno stanje četnika, partizana i ostalih formacija. Dražina strategija i taktika. Zašto su zapadni saveznici 1943. okrenuli leđa četnicima? Sve 3 knjige možete poručiti za 4800 dinara, a svaku knjigu posebno za 2200 dinara. Tvrdi povez, veći format, bogato ilustrovano. Poštarina je uključena u cenu. Porudžbine na mail pogledi@gmail.com. Potrebno je da navedete vaše ime, prezime, adresu i broj mobilnog telefona. Nova ponuda izdavačke kuće Pogledi sa velikim popustom. 5 dokumentovanih istorijskih knjiga za samo 2800 dinara. U kompletu su sledeće knjige. Prva, falsifikati komunističke istorije. Knjiga ima sledeća poglavlja. Falsifikovana dokumenta, falsifikati u filmovima, nemački falsifikati koje su koristili komunisti, falsifikovane fotografije. Druga knjiga u ponudi, saradnja partizana sa Nemcima, ustašama i Albancima. Treće izdanje jedne od najtiražnijih knjiga Pogleda sa novim dokumentima i fotografijama. Treća knjiga u ponudi, zabranjena istorija, kako i zašto se i danas istorija Drugog svetskog rata sistemski i sistematski iskrivljuje. Četvrta knjiga, Branim generala Dražu, najbolja odbrana u sudskoj istoriji. Necenzurisana odbrana doktora Dragića Joksimovića objavljena je samo u ovoj knjizi. Peta knjiga u ponudi, Krvava lista komunističkih zločina u Srbiji. Svih 5 knjiga možete poručiti za samo 2800 dinara. Poštarina je uključena u cenu. Porudžbine na mail pogledi@gmail.com. Potrebno je da navedete vaše ime, prezime, adresu i broj mobilnog telefona. Četiri knjige izdavačke kuće Pogledi za samo 2700 dinara. Prva knjiga, Miloslav Samardžić, Srbi protiv Wehrmachta, nepoznata nemačka dokumenta. Knjiga je napisana na osnovu dokumenata koja je autor nabavio u Bundesarhivu. Dokumenta su objavljena samo u ovoj knjizi. U jesen 1943. Nemci su iz dana u dan beležili kako su ih četnici pobeđivali na pravcu Višegrad-Sarajevo. Ekskluzivna dokumentovana priča o najvećoj operaciji protiv sila osovine van glavnih frontova u Evropi. Druga knjiga, Miloslav Samardžić, Krvavi Vaskrs 1944. Saveznička bombardovanja srpskih gradova. Zašto su saveznici bombardovali centralne zone srpskih gradova po tepih sistemu, dok su u gradovima na zapadu Jugoslavije gađali vojne objekte na periferiji? Treća knjiga, Predrag D. Ivanović, Ko su Ljotićevci, jedna od najvažnijih knjiga srpske emigracije iz pera predratnog beogradskog pravnika. Četvrta knjiga, Vladimir Đorđević, Krvavi Božić, istinita priča o stradanju srpskog naroda 1945. godine. Po motivima ove knjige ekranizovana je istoimena drama. Sve 4 knjige možete poručiti za samo 2700 dinara. Poštarina je uključena u cenu. Porudžbine na mail pogledi@gmail.com. Potrebno je da navedete vaše ime, prezime, adresu i broj mobilnog telefona.
Nova ponuda izdavačke kuće Pogledi sa velikim popustom. Edicija Komandanti iz pera Miloslava Samardžića. Knjige o generalu Draži, Račiću, Kalabiću i Paloševiću za samo 2600 dinara. General, istorijski roman o ključnim događajima iz 1943. godine. Kako je general Draža komandovao najvećim operacijama protiv osovine pod pritiskom Engleza u pozadini, a Nemaca i partizana na frontu. Ovaj roman je filmska priča za igrani film General. Knjiga o Račiću, biografija glavnog Dražinog vojskovođe. Sve Račićeve bitke protiv Nemaca, ustaša i komunista. Istina o Kalabiću, 5. dopunjeno izdanje najčitanije knjige Pogleda. Istina o pravom i lažnom Kalabiću. Major Palošević, ratni put jednog od prvih Dražinih komandanata. Sve 4 knjige možete poručiti za samo 2600 dinara. Poštarina je uključena u cenu. Porudžbine na mail pogledi@gmail.com. Potrebno je da navedete vaše ime, prezime, adresu i broj mobilnog telefona.